And to start us off this morning, I call the CEO of Advocates for International Development to make her opening remarks, and then the President of the East Africa Law Society, who will officially kick off our session. Thank you and welcome, Madam CEO.
Thank you very much indeed. Greetings. I'm delighted to join you at this session today for no other reason than knowing that I'm in excellent company. The reason I say this is because it's the insightful and interested in-house counsel who would be curious enough and sufficiently knowledgeable to understand how important this agenda is to their business, to their profession, and to the world. So why am I saying this? It all sounds a trifle melodramatic. Well, it is not. Today, we're going to hear about the importance of being a responsible business and why it is that by working responsibly, your businesses are going to thrive. You will hear from the Global Compact about why the Sustainable Development Agenda, the SDG agenda, is so essential, and also why it's important to business community, the legal community, and to your clients as well as to your customers. And indeed, why multinationals like Unilever are embracing the SDGs so very passionately. Indeed, the CEO Commission, chaired by Paul Polman, the former CEO of Unilever, reported that adopting the SDGs within their strategic objectives offers a $12 trillion business opportunity. Imagine that. We will hear from some of the most successful businesses like Safaricom and international law firms like White & Case why embracing this agenda is so essential and important to them. Not only for doing good in the world, but importantly, why it makes responsible business sense to do so. But first, let me tell you a little bit about Advocates for International Development, or A4ID as I like to call them. A4ID is a small non-profit, but we leverage the power of over 50,000 lawyers who donate their time and their skills to work with our development partners, who include over 900 NGOs, social enterprises, development country governments, and organizations such as the UN, the World Bank, to use the law more effectively. So far, our work has impacted in over 130 countries. We believe the law can and should be used to eradicate global poverty. The Sustainable Development Goals are at the very heart of what we do. The rule of law and human rights are fundamental to civil society and successful business. And our focus on the UN guiding principles and business and human rights are a pivotal part of this too. We are about to embark on an ambitious agenda, which is a very ambitious undertaking, which we've called the SDG Legal Initiative. A4ID, together with a select number of law firms and corporate partners, are working on this initiative. It is, if you like, a call to action to the global legal profession to work towards the achievement of the SDG agenda. And we have until the 2030 to do so. And the clock is ticking, and it's ticking loudly. It is now more important than ever that lawyers use their skills to advance positive change. Our SDG Legal Initiative aims to start a movement whereby the entire world's legal profession firstly learns about the Sustainable Development Goals by raising awareness of the goals like we are doing today. Secondly, understands the interconnection between the law and development. And thirdly, works to achieve the SDGs like only lawyers know how. More perhaps than any other profession, lawyers know how. Lawyers know how to problem solve. As we know, lawyers are great problem solvers. Lawyers know how to use the law and change the laws for the greater good. Lawyers know how to influence. If a profession can influence, it's the legal community. Lawyers can and do influence their CEOs, their boards, and politicians that govern us. Lawyers get things done on a big scale with significant benefit for large numbers of people. And lawyers are great at completing complex tasks within tight deadlines. So if what I've said resonates with you in any way, as I hope it does, if you want to become involved in something which will test your resilience and will require your ingenuity, patience, and skill while tapping into your sense of doing the right thing, making a positive difference, and contributing to something hugely worthwhile, join us. We're already working with the largest law firms in the world, as well as some of the largest corporates, but that is not enough. We want to work with the world's entire legal profession. A word of warning, this is not for the faint-hearted. It is challenging, but it is uplifting. I promise you that. Imagine it, the collective brain power, the problem-solving ability, the knowledge of the law and influence which the legal profession has. I ask you, what other profession can realistically have such an impact? So if you feel inspired to take practical action to end poverty, to protect the planet, and to ensure that all people enjoy peace and prosperity, join us. And with that, I encourage you to listen carefully to our next speakers. Thank you. I think it's over to you now, Mr. President.
Thank you, Yasmin. It is indeed my honor and privilege to welcome you all to this very important webinar, which is also organized under the auspices of the Business and Human Rights Committee and the In-House Lawyers Committee. Today's session really is intended to analyze the role of in-house counsel in guiding businesses on incorporating responsible business and sustainable development goals. Before I speak further, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Advocates for International Development for their support as the sponsors of this event. I would also like to thank our panelists for taking time off to share their experience. White and Case, thank you. Safaricom, thank you. And all the other panelists, thank you so much for sparing your time to share your experience with us. In that regard, I would like to just make two important points. One is that, as Yasmin has stated, the 2030 agenda came into force, I think, on 1st January 2016. All the East African states have adopted the agenda, and it's now 9 years only remaining to the proposed deadline. And therefore, as the deadline draws closer, we must ensure that we rope in crucial stakeholders to enable the realization of these goals, which is becoming ever more necessary. The SDG mechanism and businesses which are mindful of good corporate citizenship have one enduring objective, and which is to incrementally improve the life experience of our people. A business in aligning itself with the SDGs stands to obtain a better public image and ultimately greater consumer satisfaction with their brand. The role of in-house counsel in meshing of these two is therefore indispensable. And our role as lawyers is also indispensable. We must work together to achieve the SDG agenda for 2030, and which is crucially aimed at improving the life experiences of our people. I therefore take this opportunity once again to thank you for sparing your time to join us. And I am hopeful that everyone attending this webinar will find it engaging and will also find purpose in pursuing the agenda for Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you all, and I wish you great deliberations. Asante sana.
Thank you, Mr. President, for those excellent remarks. And I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Ms. Yasmin Batliwala for excellent remarks and for both for setting the context and the overview on which this webinar is going to be based on today. My name is Martin Mavengina. I am going to be your moderator for this session, and I'll quickly go into it and I'll introduce our speakers, and then I'll hold the first speaker to speak. So the first speaker is Jessica Lobo, who works with Global Goals as a program manager at UN Global Compact Network. She's going to make a presentation on SDGs and highlight the global trends adopted by businesses in integrating sustainable development goals. Jessica.
Hello, good morning, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. I think I've got a couple of slides. If we could get those up on the screen, that would be super.
Just give us a few minutes. Yeah, just a few seconds. Jessica, you can proceed to share your screen. You've been granted access by ELS.
Oh, okay. You want me to share my screen?
Yes, just share your presentation.
Okay, excuse me, everybody. Sorry, I thought that was going to be shared. So just hang on a second while I get up my slides. Excellent. Well, I hope everybody can see that, and thank you again for inviting me to speak today. My name is Jessica, and I'm the Global Goals Program Manager at the UN Global Compact Network UK. We are part of the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative. And we have over 14,000 companies who have made a commitment to support our 10 principles that drive sustainability. And those are principles derived from UN treaties in the areas of human rights, labour, environment, and anti-corruption. So as mentioned, I lead the Global Goals Programme in the UK network, and our role is to support all of the UK members to do those three pieces up on the screen. So first of all, to operationalise those 10 principles. Second, to report annually on progress. And third is to support the wider UN development agenda. And of course, that wider UN development agenda is today best represented by the Sustainable Development Goals, and here they are on the screen. So what are the Sustainable Development Goals? Well, this is the plan for the planet up until 2030. They were passed in 2015 unanimously. I think the UN undertook one of the world's largest consultations ever to arrive at this agenda. And they were passed unanimously, these 17 goals. And together the idea is that they will bring about the future that we want. So tackling inequalities, fighting climate change, and protecting the planet. So you can see there are 17 different goals. They're all incredibly interrelated. Beneath these 17 goals sit 169 targets and then 232 indicators to measure our progress. And I suppose I should just add that while it was governments that made the commitment to these goals, the responsibility really is on all of us to drive the change that we need to be able to achieve them by 2030. So not just governments, not just civil society and individuals, but businesses too. And that's what really I'm here to speak about today. So the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, I think some people call it the world's to-do list, the world's strategy. We're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into what those goals are. And to start with, I just wanted to have a look specifically at one particular goal as an example. So goal 12, responsible consumption and production. If you see the full title, we'll really get a little bit more detail about what this goal is trying to achieve. So goal 12, ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. And then if you go into the target level, and I've got them up here on the screen, or I suppose I should say I've got some of them up here on the screen, the ones that could fit, you actually start to understand what it is that this goal is trying to achieve and all of the different individual actions that the world needs to be doing. And I've highlighted, I think, a couple of them. So you can see we're looking at things around food waste, we're looking at chemicals, we're looking at substantially reducing waste through prevention, recycling, reuse, reduction. We're looking at companies and actually integrating that sustainability information into their reporting. We're looking at public procurement practices, looking at actually raising awareness. So I suppose really I just wanted to take this little bit of a deep dive so that you can understand that actually beneath this goal and beneath that kind of 2 or 3 words that you see with the title sits this wealth of targets and actions that we need to do, and actually real guidance on what it is that this goal is trying to achieve. And the same is for all of the other 17 goals, the other 16 goals. So I just wanted to spend a little bit of time looking at why business in particular would want to align with this agenda. We know that we need business on board so we help us achieve these goals, but why would business benefit from it? Well, there was a study that was done shortly after the goals were passed in 2015, which found that embracing the global goals could generate $12 trillion of new business value a year. So there's a huge market opportunity in actually embracing this agenda and actually driving positive change towards it. I think looking at the macro level, all of the things that the Sustainable Development Goals seek to achieve are good for business. So better educated and more productive workforce, that's good for business. Economic and political stability, that's good for business. You know, more fair and just societies, climate resilience, and so on. All of these things at the macro level are good for business. If we look a little bit more at the micro level, actually engaging with the Sustainable Development Goals and that kind of wider sustainability agenda makes a business more attractive for investors and customers who are now demanding and now expecting that businesses are engaging with this. And I think part of that is about building trust. You notice there on goal 12, it was talking about companies actually integrating sustainability data into their reporting. What we're seeing is that customers, clients, investors, stakeholders are expecting businesses now to actually be demonstrating how they are reducing their negative impact and driving positive impact, and actually starting to report and communicate on it. So there's demands coming from stakeholders, but also it's building that trust and building a kind of social license to operate. There's a couple of other points there on the screen. Improves competitiveness in hiring best human capital. We know now that the best and the brightest people get to choose where they want to work. And what we're finding is that they want to choose where to work in companies that are demonstrating a purpose beyond profit. Improves management of the supply chain, lowering operational costs, improves access to public procurement. I think the point there at the bottom of the screen, sharing a global language, and the Sustainable Development Goals are global, and businesses that want to be able to demonstrate how they're aligning to sustainability by actually aligning to the Sustainable Development Goals can share this global language that everybody speaks. The problem is that after 5 years, or I guess we're almost at 6 years now, as the goals were adopted at the end of September. After 6 years, we're not on track to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals. And I've just put a couple of stats there up on the screen. You know, it's estimated we're still 257 years away from closing the economic gender gap globally. There are still 150 million children in labour, 700 million people in poverty. Global temperatures are still on track for a 3.5 degree rise. And we all know some of the catastrophic consequences that can bring about. And of course, COVID-19 has put us further back. So even if we were making progress on some of these goals, we've been put back by the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic. The good news is that companies are already starting to align with this agenda, and we're already seeing companies setting targets and taking actions towards the Sustainable Development Goals. I suppose one of the problems, and this is globally speaking, one of the problems is that companies are setting targets, but they're not necessarily setting targets which are ambitious enough or actually align with the progress that we need to make by 2030. So companies are setting these kind of incremental targets and doing better and better every year, but the targets that they're setting are not enough for us to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. And you can see there's some stats that we've done. So there's this real performance gap between what businesses are currently doing and what we need businesses to be able to be doing for us to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think this is obviously a quote from the UN Secretary General, that it's becoming really clear that we need businesses to step up and have this more ambitious response and create this transformational change that we need. And so what we've been doing at the UN Global Compact is we've been developing some benchmarks that can help us shift from these incremental goals to absolute goals which are grounded in science and actually are setting what each company needs to achieve so that we can achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. We're trying to encourage the shift from output-oriented goals to impact-oriented goals that really drive positive outcomes. And we're trying to shift from independent targets, sustainability targets, which really kind of stand alone and are separate from the business, to an interconnected system where sustainability is really embedded throughout the core business strategy and model. And what we've come up with, and I'm sure that the writing here is probably a little bit too small for you to see on the screen, but I can share a link so that you can explore this later. But what we've come up with is 10 SDG business benchmarks. And what these benchmarks do is that they translate the SDGs for business. And I know some of the criticism we hear, especially from businesses, that some of the language is perhaps more written for governments and not necessarily for businesses. It's hard for them to understand where businesses should be aligning with the SDGs. And we're trying to eradicate that challenge with these business benchmarks. So you can see there we've developed 10. The idea is that we're going to keep on researching, potentially add a couple more to this list. But these are the 10 benchmarks that any business can align with to ensure that they are making a significant contribution and actually helping us to achieve the SDGs by 2030. And you can see they range from lots of different SDGs. The idea of the benchmarks is they are applicable to any business of any sector or any industry of any size. And we've produced, I think I've got them on my next screen here, we've produced a wealth of guidance which actually go into deep detail about what these different benchmarks mean, some of the actions that you can take, and actually the kind of our full integration with guide with lots of case studies of how you can start aligning with these benchmarks. So the idea is that any business who is looking to engage with this agenda can take a look at those benchmarks, align with them. They've got all of the guidance and the resources there, and then they can show that they are actually contributing to the Sustainable Development Goals and really driving the positive and ambitious changes that we need to create the future that we want. So I think that's all from me. I'm going to hand back to the moderator, but there are a wealth of resources on our website, and of course, please do contact us if you'd like to know a little bit more about those benchmarks or any of the work that we do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jessica Lobo, for that comprehensive presentation around the SDGs. Without further ado, I'd want to invite Ms. Claire Cornell. She's a partner at White and Case, and she'll make a presentation on the overview of international frameworks relevant for business to embrace responsible business practices and sustainability. Claire, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Thank you to the East African Law Society and to Advocates for International Development for the invitation to join you today. I'm really honoured to participate on the panel with you all. I think it's been some really important framing from the speakers already. So I am a disputes lawyer by background, but since 2018, I have had the privilege to lead my firm's Business and Human Rights Group, which is a cross-practice, cross-discipline group to assist our clients. And I also sit on the firm's Responsible Business Group and on the firm's ESG committee. The next slide, please. going to give an overview in 3 different parts. The first focus on some of the international frameworks. Have limited time and there are many, so I'm going to highlight 3 or 4. In the second part, I will focus on some of the regional and national frameworks, and then I'll make some comments on some of the practical steps that companies can take with their existing or potentially international supply chains. Next slide, please. Thanks. So there is a really wide range of global and regional institutions and international frameworks which are relevant to sustainable and responsible business conduct. TCFD, OECD, for the SDGs, ESG, is a true alphabet soup of acronyms. And the source and subject and scope of the framework will differ, but they're all pulling in the same direction. I think that's important to note. Some of the frameworks that have been developed by the larger global and regional institutions, which you'll be familiar with, like the United Nations, we've already heard, and the OECD, and other frameworks were developed by maybe national institutions or ad hoc groups like the Financial Stability Board. The frameworks have specific scope and focus sometimes, like human rights or labor or climate change, and others are more general on business sustainability and responsibility. The direction of travel for the frameworks is that the more recent frameworks are imposing clearer and higher standards than the historical frameworks, which were perhaps more aspirational. So if we can just click through to there we go. So I'm going to look at the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. We've already heard about the Global Compact, so I won't spend much time on that. Can keep clicking through. And then the framework developed by the OECD, the Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises. The OECD has also developed due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct, which advises businesses on the implementation of the guidelines. And then I'll touch briefly on the third one, which is the Equator Principles, which was developed for financial institutions. Next slide, please. So in June 2011, the UN Human Rights Council unanimously endorsed the guiding principles on business and human rights. They're often referred to as the UNGPs. The UNGPs were the first corporate human rights responsibility instrument endorsed by a UN body. And over the last decade, they celebrated their 10-year anniversary this year. They've been widely adopted by states, businesses, and organizations that they are now constituted a pretty authoritative international standard. In East Africa, both Kenya and Uganda have published national action plans on business and human rights, which are based on the UN guiding principles. And there are a number of national frameworks, including France, Germany, and the UK, which also refer to the UN guiding principles. And although they are not binding, the implementation by states is shifting these soft law principles into hard law obligations. So the principles themselves are a set of guidelines for both states and businesses to prevent, address, and remedy human rights, adverse human rights impacts in connection with business operations. And they're based on 3 pillars: protect, respect, and remedy. Now, protect is the duty of states. The states have the duty to protect their people against human rights abuses within their territory, their jurisdiction, including adverse impacts by businesses. And to fulfill that duty will require the states to take appropriate steps to prevent, investigate, punish, and redress abuses. And that might be through effective legislation or regulations, policies, or adjudication. The second pillar, respect, is directed at businesses. Businesses have the responsibility to respect human rights. Discharging that responsibility means avoiding human rights infringements and addressing adverse human rights impacts. We'll come to what that really can mean. What's important is that the business responsibility to respect human rights is not contingent on the state's ability or willingness to protect human rights, the first pillar. The responsibilities and obligations of the states and the businesses are distinct but complementary. And because businesses can have an impact on the whole spectrum of internationally recognized human rights, business responsibility applies to all such rights, and human rights can't be offset. So a corporate social responsibility plan in relation to one right can't compensate for doing harm in relation to another. Now, the third pillar is remedy, and that's directed at both states and businesses. And the aim is to allow people who have been affected by adverse human rights harms to seek redress for the harm that they've experienced as a consequence of the business activity. So that might be through a state mechanism, might be a judicial or non-judicial, but it could also be a non-state-based mechanism. It could be a grievance mechanism instituted by a business. For all three pillars together, it's clear that it's no longer sufficient for businesses to simply do things as a philanthropic thing. They must respect human rights and avoid intentionally or directly infringing on human rights. Now, as I mentioned, the UN Guiding Principles are not legally binding, but they're so widely adopted now that non-compliance, especially significant or consistent non-compliance, can create financial and reputational risk. Next slide, please. Now, we've already heard about the UN Global Compact. I'm pleased to confirm my firm is one of the signatories to the UN Global Compact. We work on our communication on progress each year. The Global Compact predates the UNGPs, but they're wider in scope than the UNGPs. But again, I think that the aim is for business to be a force for good, and they're pulling in the same direction. I won't spend too much time on that one. Go to the next slide, please. So the OECD guidelines are even older in their first edition. So in 1976, the OECD adopted the first edition of the Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises, or MNEs. You can see the image of the most recent on the left. They've been updated since 1976, and the most recent is 2011, when the guidelines were aligned with the UNGPs, with specific references to business responsibility for human rights. The guidelines were developed by governance for multinational enterprises operating in or from the adhering countries, and they contain, again, non-binding principles and standards for responsible business conduct in human rights, labor rights, environmental protection, technology, taxation, competition, and combating bribery. They're the only multilaterally agreed and comprehensive code of responsible business conduct which governments have committed to promoting. All 34 OECD countries and 12 non-OECD countries have adhered to the guidelines, and those countries and the key partners represent about 80% of world trade and investment. And collectively, they have the ability to set an international benchmark in relation to responsible business. To accompany the guidelines, the OECD has also developed the guidance document, which is what you can see on the right side of the slide. The guidance for due diligence advises companies on the implementation of the guidelines by providing plain language explanations of the guidelines recommendations, and also answering a number of frequently asked questions about the guidelines. There are also sector and issue specific guidance available that might be for agricultural or extractive industries, garment and footwear. There's a guidance, for example, on identifying and addressing the use of child labor. These OECD guidelines, and in particular the OECD due diligence guidance, are important international standards for responsible business conduct, and they're referenced in a number of the legislation guidance, statutory guidance in legislation, and some of the recommendations. So, for example, the EU conflict minerals regulation refers to OECD due diligence guidance. Next slide, please. So one more to mention, particularly significant for financing, the Equator Principles. These were launched in 2003 by 10 banks, and again, have enjoyed great success, now 124 Equator Principles financial institutions, or EPFIs, in 37 different countries. So they cover the majority of international project finance debt within developed and emerging markets. And they include a number of financial institutions that are headquartered across the African continent. The Equator Principles are a risk management framework adopted by the financial institutions for determining, assessing, and managing environmental and social risk in the projects that they finance. And they provide the minimum standard for the financial institutions' due diligence and monitoring to support the institutions in responsible risk decision making. Initially, the Equator Principles were based on the International Finance Corporation's performance standards, which many of you may already be familiar with, but they've been revised several times, now in their 4th edition, and strengthened. And the most recent edition enhances the assessment of human rights impacts of projects by mandating that a human rights risk assessment should be done commensurate with the risk categorization of a particular project, and again, based on the UNGPs. Again, the Equator Principles are voluntary for the financial institutions, but the standards can be given contractual binding force through the requirements of the environmental, social, and human rights impact assessment in the project documentation. Next slide, please. So turning to some of the regional and national frameworks, really interesting initiative this year, the European Parliament passed a legislative initiative for a European Union directive on mandatory human rights, environmental, and good governance due diligence for companies operating within the European Union. And that's an important point to start with. The idea of the initiative is that it would apply to all businesses that operate within the EU, not only those that are headquartered within the EU. I refer to it as a parliamentary initiative because it's not yet a proposal by the European Commission, but it certainly put pressure on the European Commission to deliver its own legislative proposal. And if the legislative proposal were adopted as a directive, then each EU member state would transpose the directive into its national law, typically within 2 years. So we're looking at sort of 2 to 3 year timeline, but I think it's another indication of the importance of sustainability on the European Union's political and legislative agenda. The parliamentary initiative has 2 main pillars. The first is for companies to conduct due diligence in relation to human rights, environment, and governance. And that would be not only in their own operations, but in their supply chains. And the parliamentary initiative proposes a very wide definition of what that supply chain would be. They use the term value chains, which would extend to all business and investment activities, direct and indirect business relationships, upstream and downstream. And the obligation in the proposal would apply to private or state-owned companies operating under the law of a member state within the EU market. So it could have a significant extraterritorial effect for the companies which may be headquartered outside of the EU. The second main pillar of the proposal is the creation of rights for individuals and communities to hold companies liable for non-compliance with that first due diligence obligation. And the remedies, which would be set out at the member state level from implementation, would hold the companies accountable and possibly be fined for causing harm or contributing to harm, unless they can prove that they carried out their due diligence obligations appropriately and took measures to prevent or mitigate harm that's identified. The initiative envisages a regime which would include fines which would be comparable in magnitude to the fines that are currently provided for in competition law and data protection law, which, if we take that as the model, would be a percentage of global turnover, which certainly focuses the mind. It could also result in a temporary or indefinite exclusion from public procurement, from state aid and other public support schemes. So it's really one to watch because there will be more movement, I think, this autumn on where this will go within the European Union. Next slide, please. But the European Union proposal is in a long line of frameworks over the last decade. And where a number of jurisdictions have introduced legislation often in relation to specific issues that are relevant for business sustainability and responsibility, and many of which have an extraterritorial effect. I'm going to focus on some of those within Europe. I'm not aware of any similar legislation yet within East African jurisdictions, but I'm here to learn as well. I'll focus on two of those just as examples. In France in 2017 and in Germany this year. So in France in 2017, the French Parliament adopted the Duty of Vigilance law, which requires all large French companies, that's with over 5,000 employees in France or 10,000 worldwide, to undertake due diligence with regard to the companies they control and all of their contractors and suppliers. And again, it's structured around two mechanisms. The first is the civil duty of vigilance, which requires companies to develop a vigilant plan in consultation with stakeholders and trade unions. And the plan should identify, analyze, and map the risks for human rights and the environment arising from the company's activities, and should also include appropriate measures to mitigate those risks. And the scope of business activities is defined very broadly, so it can include not only the own operations and subsidiaries, but also suppliers and contractors, and therefore can also impact foreign companies which supply or contract with those large French businesses. The second is the redress and liability mechanism for breaches of the obligations by companies. So the Act provides that companies that fail to publish and implement vigilance plans can be subject to court-ordered injunctions or penalty payments, and parent companies can be held liable if damage results from the failure to properly implement an adequate plan. Now, I'll come back to that parent company liability. There have been a number of lawsuits filed in France and formal notices sent to a number of companies since the introduction of the Act. For Germany, so in June this year, the German Parliament adopted the law on corporate due diligence in supply chains, which imposes for the first time in Germany a binding obligation on companies to establish, implement, and update due diligence procedures to improve compliance with specified core human rights, and to a limited extent some environmental protection as well. The Act will come into force on the 1st of January 2023 for large companies, 3,000 employees in Germany, and then it will be extended to still large companies, but slightly smaller, with 1,000 employees from 2024. And the new obligation for supply chain due diligence under the German Act will inevitably impact foreign companies doing business with German companies. Again, this cascade effect of the companies through their operations and then their supply chains. It's estimated that there'll be 700 companies affected in 2023 to nearly 3,000 in 2024. And for enforcement, again, compliance with these obligations will be enforceable through administrative proceedings, an administrative offence law, and fines as well. And there have been a number of these initiatives. At least 2 other European jurisdictions are actively considering legislation at the moment in Luxembourg and Belgium. I think there will be more to come, whether it's through the directive implementation in the next 2 years, 2 to 3 years, or through other national initiatives. Next slide, please. So alongside these legislative initiatives, with their own mechanisms for enforcement, there's been a growing trend for litigation seeking corporate accountability. Now, we've heard from Jessica about the really important opportunities and benefits of responsible business conduct. With opportunities, there are also inevitably risks if the responsible business conduct is not properly implemented. And some of that can be through litigation risk. In the UK, our highest court, the Supreme Court, has issued a series of landmark decisions on parent company liability under English law for claims alleging environmental damage and human rights abuses by subsidiaries. And there have been a number of cases filed in France, Germany, the Netherlands, and elsewhere. The key points here are that the the extraterritorial effect that is inevitable from some of these decisions. So the harms, I've put in brackets the countries in which the allegations of harm were supposed to have taken place. And so some of those have been successfully defended by the companies, and some of those have been settled, and some are ongoing. But the cases are being brought in the UK, France, Germany, and Netherlands for harms that are suffered elsewhere. The UK decision in Okpabi and Shell has rejected a strict formalistic approach to corporate separation, and it's jurisdictional only at the moment. There hasn't been a decision on the merits, but it's confirming that companies can't rely on corporate form alone to avoid risks associated with operations of subsidiaries. And clarifying that the general presumption that a parent company will not be liable for the acts of subsidiaries is in question. And it's highlighting the importance of active corporate governance, due diligence, again, coming back to this due diligence theme, and internal controls for managing the significant human rights and environmental risks of business operations. So the due diligence undertaken by businesses to meet international or regional standards can be increasingly significant in minimizing and managing litigation risk in domestic courts. Next slide, please. So what steps can companies take? I think we have a lot of in-house lawyers on the webinar today. So just 5 thoughts to leave you with. First, to think about your supply chain mapping. Like companies identifying their own direct suppliers, contractors, at least tier 1, but depending on the sector, you think about tier 2 or significantly for certain raw materials as well, responsible sourcing. Companies may also be the tier 1 supplier for another company, so thinking about horizon scanning what requirements for due diligence may be in the future. It can take time to put in place the appropriate policies and processes to manage the risks. So then a risk assessment is important of your own operations and your own supply chains. Engagement with your stakeholders, identifying the relevant frameworks, thinking about what other regional or national legislation may apply. Those risk assessments can be conducted by external providers. We've assisted with some of them, consultancy firms. Many are conducted within the organization as well, taking into account the general and sector-specific guidelines. The OECD due diligence guidance is a really useful starting point. I'd emphasize you can't do everything at once. So identify the most salient risks and start out on that journey. And in carrying out the risk assessments, companies should take into account what legislation may be applicable outside of their own territory as well. And that engagement with the stakeholders, I think, is really important for thinking about what those risks are and how to prevent and how to mitigate those risks. Once you've identified those as part of that mapping process, think about what policies, maybe in relation to the critical business responsibility issues, bribery, corruption, child labor, human rights. Having the policies alone is not enough. They need to be implemented, which will be through publication, through and through training, like making policies available on notice boards, through the intranet, and through making sure that everybody within the organization is aware, and making sure that the standard of conduct that is expected is implemented through all the different parts of the organization. So that can be done through training, companies training their employers, their suppliers, their contractors on the existence and implementation of the policies and expectations, ideally monitoring and recording, maybe with recording the outcome of those, and then think about what remedial training might be needed if you can't pass the standard expected within the training. And showing incremental improvement. Many of the reporting obligations emphasize that journey and that incremental improvement year on year. And then not forgetting remedy. So that might be through a grievance mechanism, both for internal stakeholders. That might be a whistleblowing policy, but also for external stakeholders, where there can be an adverse impact. And that's the key pillar, that third pillar of the UNGPs, making sure that external stakeholders can also contact and communicate with someone in the company about concerns or impacts that the company can have. The person receiving those, ideally would be somebody who's independent. That might be a general counsel team, or they might be ideally placed to handle those complaints, or there are a number of external service providers as well. I think the really important point is to set out on that journey and take those first steps, and then continue to improve as the legislation and the risks continue. I will stop there in the interest of time, but I'd be very happy to answer questions later in the webinar. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Claire, for that rich presentation. Quite comprehensive. Key highlights about it is the fact that you pointed out that Kenya and Uganda have national action plans on business and human rights, and then the OECD Guidelines and the Equator Principles. Thank you for that excellent presentation. So in the interest of time, I'd like to invite our next speaker, who's Ms. Nadia Aziz. She's an in-house counsel at Safaricom PLC, and she'll be making a presentation on experience sharing on how companies in East Africa are adopting and integrating responsible business and sustainable development goals. She'll be presenting a case study on Safaricom PLC. Nadia, you're welcome.
Thank you, Martin. I'm very happy to be here. Good morning to everyone. I see it's not yet noon. We have 4 minutes to go. So I did have a presentation. Yes, thanks, Patrick, for displaying it. I will be giving the story of Safaricom, and I'll be giving that in 3 bits. So I'll start with a little bit of history on Safaricom, talk about our main agenda, which is transforming lives, and then go straight into the SDG integration to our objectives. So Safaricom started its operations sometime in 2000, and as at our latest report, we have about 40 million subscribers. And you will find that because of the large number of subscribers that we have, most of them are registered on our mobile money platform, which is M-Pesa, and which has increased financial inclusion for, everybody in Kenya, including women. Actually, a study done by MIT and Georgetown University showed that access to M-Pesa has lifted nearly 2% of Kenyan households out of extreme poverty. But we were not always the most successful company. We do have another side of the story, and which we like to refer to as a real driver behind our success. So we did know from the onset that for us to be successful, we needed to find out why we exist and what our motivation to come to work every day would be. And so we needed to look for a purpose that went beyond selling airtime and facilitating communication. And we realized that we had the opportunity to play a role in the social and economic transformation of the country, and hence transforming lives became our reason for being. So how do we as Safaricom transform lives? And we do this through our network, our products, and our services. And we express this purpose in various ways that aim to provide sustainable, customer-centric, insight-driven solutions to the societies around us. And we have stuck out our neck a couple of times, to advocate for things that people may not really want to be associated with, which include climate change, anti-corruption, children's rights, simply because we believe that it's the right thing to do. And transforming lives has meant that we keenly listen to our customers' needs and constantly put them first and at the center of our business strategy. And it also means making long-term decisions at the cost of short-term gains. And because transforming lives has been the center of what we do, then automatically the SDGs became very interesting to us. And we realized that as a company that, had become such an integral part of the lives of Kenyans, we needed a blueprint that would help propel our purpose even further, the purpose of transforming lives. And the SDGs provided the best opportunity for us to do that. And Safaricom integrating the SDGs is not as straightforward as you would think. We had to do a lot of research on how businesses could integrate the SDGs. And we also sought insights from financial markets and various commissions to ensure that we have the correct information before we actually set goals that we may not be able to achieve. And we did find from the onset that there was no one-size-fits-all model which you could simply adopt. And we therefore went to each business unit. So Safaricom is divided into various divisions, which we then refer to as business units. And we had a conversation with each business unit from their perspective on what would be applicable to them and what would help them enhance their performance, open new and value-adding business channels, and help overcome business obstacles. So instead of asking what we can do for the SDGs, we flipped the question to what SDGs could do for us from a business perspective. And this approach, enabled us to adopt and integrate the SDGs in a way that became that made sense for our various business divisions and for our customers. And so we do know that there are 17 SDGs. Most of them are directly related to our business, but we took a different stand on the SDGs. So rather than integrating all 17 of them, we picked out 9 of the 17 that we then link to the objectives in our company and specifically to the objectives for the various divisions within our company. And so I will just read out our SDG commitment to everyone, which is we commit to deliver connectivity and innovative product and services that will provide unmatched solutions to meet the needs of Kenyans by enabling access through our technologies and partners and by exploring opportunities in health, education, and energy. We will do so by managing our operations responsibly and ethically. This will stimulate growth and generate value for our company, society, and economy. So you did find that 9 of the 17 SDGs from that commitment stand out. And what we then did was each business unit had 1 or 2 SDGs that would then be their SDGs that they would then follow through with. So I'll give you an example of the legal department, which sits under the corporate affairs division within Safaricom. And we found as a legal department that the goal of peace, justice, and strong institutions resonated well with what we do. And what we then chose to do is, I know Claire talked about supply chain management, and we decided to put up a challenge for ourselves and our suppliers. And in order to ensure that we are doing the minimum to have suppliers that are conducting ethical business, we made it mandatory for all our suppliers to sign up to the Code of Ethics for Businesses in Kenya. And those that were not signing up, we would give them notices and ask them and tell them that we would be dropping them as suppliers. And as it our latest report, 97% of our suppliers have signed up to the Code of Ethics for businesses in Kenya. Besides that, we made it mandatory. So we do deal with dealers who deal with our customers. So we made it, we started a program sometime last year, where 2 years ago, we were training our dealers on the importance of documentation, so KYC documentation. And with time, this would then reduce things like money laundering, because we will be able to identify the customer which person owns which SIM card and what's been done on that specific line. And we have trained about 83% of our dealers as at our latest report. Besides that, we do conduct training for our staff so that they're made aware of their obligations. And 98.5% of our staff have been taken through the ethics and anti-corruption training. Now, these things that I'm talking about are specific to one goal only, which would be peace, justice, and strong institutions. There are various other things being done under each other objectives, including, for instance, when it comes to climate change, we do have a company-wide objective of ensuring that we are a sustainable company by growing as many trees as we can. As at our latest report, 650,000 trees have been grown in the last year by Safaricom. Besides that, we also transformed our sites, the sites that have that provide the network to our customers. We did ensure that they're now transformed to hybrid energy sources. We did partner with a company that allows us to provide solar power to customers. We also partnered with another company to provide low-income households to clean, affordable, convenient, and reliable cooking gas. And these are just some of the examples that I have picked up, especially from our sustainability report that we published yesterday in regards to what Safaricom has done. So the main question then would be, how is this done? So if you go to the PowerPoint presentation, if you go to slide 6, the most important thing that we did was first identifying the divisional SDGs. So the 9 SDGs were then mapped to specific divisions. And then under each division, there are various departments. So each department was then able to pick up the SDG most relevant to that department. And those goals or that specific SDG is then linked back to your performance goals. So at the end of the year, when you're sitting with your manager and going through your KPIs and what you did, that specific goal will be linked to an SDG. So rather than make it voluntary for you to decide whether you want to link your goals to the SDGs or not, it's mandatory. So each goal that you have is then linked to an SDG to ensure that, number one, we are doing what we're supposed to do, and number two, that we have a proper reporting structure at the end of the year. And we then had sustainability champions within each department. So you will find that not everybody will understand what they need to do to meet the SDG objectives. And so we needed to have sustainability champions within each department. So I am the sustainability champion within the legal department. So my job is really just to ensure that when people are setting their objectives, I make it a little bit easier for them to link those objectives to the SDGs and provide training to the team. And because we are a big company, we have about 6,000 employees, just make sure that the information is being cascaded down well to the staff. That's one of the things that we've done. And the heads of departments have also been mandated to align what they do to the SDG. So rather than just make it's your problem, it's let us all deal with it, because it's something that we're all supposed to do. And at the end of the year, we do have a sustainability report that goes out every year, which makes it much easier for us to then be able to compare. So where are we now versus where were we last year, and where do we intend to be next year? It's not the perfect way to do it. And we do realize that sustainability remains a journey. It's not a destination, and integrating these goals into our daily operations has been both an inspiring and a humbling process. And this is a constant reminder that if we want to be a 100-year-old company, that we must not leave anyone behind. And this is our example. And it is not the perfect example, but this is how we do it. And we cannot be successful when the society or the society that we operate in is failing. So we need to work together with society, with our staff, to make sure that we do our bit to ensure that we meet the goals within the SDGs. Every company has a story. This is our story. Now, what's yours? Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Nadia, for comprehensive presentation about Safaricom's story. Our next speaker is Ivan Mugabe. He's a human rights lawyer and a senior lecturer at King Caesar University in Uganda. And he'll be making a presentation on the role of in-house counsel in advocating for non-discrimination and inclusion, with focus on disability rights when conceptualizing responsible business practices as a tool for economic sustainability for employees living with disabilities. Ivan, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much, Patrick. Now I think following on from the previous presentation, as our topic clearly stands, I'm here to make a presentation in as far as the inclusiveness of persons with disability, of course, in as far as employment is concerned. And I will kindly request if we go to the very first slide. I will actually address this discussion in 4 different categories. I will highlight why should an in-house counsel become a collaborative stakeholder in encouraging employers to enhance accessibility of labor markets to East Africans with disability. And of course, I will also quickly highlight where can an in-house counsel be collaborative in as far as encouraging employers to integrate East Africans with disabilities. To that effect, we shall identify when should this sort of engagement or interaction take place within the corporate circles, and finally how. So that's what we are meant to be looking at, and I will be expounding on each of those in the subsequent slides. Thank you very much. We'll go to the next slide. First of all, the question would be how, why, actually the reason why this is important. And I think the earlier speakers, I think it was clear, he talked about the UN guiding principles on responsible business practices. And so if we bear those in mind, then they will bring us to appreciating that in as far as protecting, respecting, and promoting human rights, then we find that making this achievable and a reality, then we find that in-house counsel could be a very collaborative stakeholder. So this is very key in order to promote a working environment that enables marginalized groups of East Africans to realize their rights. And of course, there are different rights, as we shall later on see. Of course, what we may be able here to see is that, of course, companies in the East African, which are members of the East Africa, have more of a duty to assist the government in their obligations. One of the speakers has already actually pointed out that the duties which the companies have in as far as regional, but also international frameworks are not, that they are very distinguishable from those which companies have, but they are very complementary. So in terms of achieving human rights of different groups, it becomes very important to have a more of a framework which enables a collaborative and a complementary corporate entities to some of the international legal regimes. So we have Article 27 under the Convention on Persons with Disability. It talks about the right to work. And of course, as we shall later on see, this particular obligation has been incorporated and integrated in the legal regime of different East African national legislations, as we shall see that in the subsequent discussion. So it becomes very important that it's desirable to adopt an approach which will respond to what we call intersectional or multiple instances of marginalization. Now, this area of disability, what is very interesting with this is actually it cuts across gender, it cuts across all age groups, it cuts across all races. So you'll have women with disability, men with disabilities, children with disabilities. You'll have, of course, all races, whether it's Europeans, Africans, Arabs. So you could have all forms of, categories of people can be catered for in as far as a corporate entity coming up with a recruitment framework or structure which ensures that there is the diversity diversity, which creates room for persons with disability. We can go to the next slide. Of course, again, in relation to the Y factor, this is very ideal because it makes and portrays corporate entities in such a, in as far as House Counsel is concerned, as not only compliant to national regimes, but also it portrays them as complementary entities in as far as issues of inclusiveness and disability-based approaches are concerned. Of course, we are aware that different East African countries have adopted legal regimes in as far as issues of disability are concerned. For example, if you look in Uganda, there is what we call a Persons with Disability Act, number 3 of 2020. In Kenya, there is a Persons with Disability Act, number 14 of 2003. In Tanzania, there is a Persons with Disability Act of 2010. In Rwanda, there is also a provision to that effect in as far as disability legal regime is concerned. There is Disability Law 01 of 2007. Hence, of course, by the government enacting this sort of laws, an in-house counsel can embrace an element of adopting complementary corporate structures, which will encourage a more inclusive recruitment strategy of the employees. Therefore, it becomes important to have a gesture where corporate entities adopt inclusive employment strategies that creates a corporate structure which will be a gesture of global awareness of the increasing role of disability inclusion in as far as improving diversity and in composition of corporate entities is concerned. Now, of course, it's very clear that issues of human rights are no longer a national issue. And as far as we are very clear that different member states in East Africa have come up with legislations on disability, and that not only makes it visible and apparent that this is a very pertinent aspect, but also at international level, we have the different sustainable development principles talking about social equity, distributive justice as well. We can go to the next slide, please. Of course, again, the question might be then, when can in-house counsel be a collaborative stakeholder in encouraging corporate employers to support accessibility of, to labor markets with persons with disabilities? Now, we are aware that in-house counsel plays a very key role in as far as, of course, encouraging these corporate entities to, in all different ways, incorporate or embrace African employees with disability. First and foremost, whenever in-house counsel has a sufficient knowledge of interconnected interactions between issues of human rights and employers' rights, and as far as disability rights. So there is some sort of a correlation which suffices between employability, but also issues of inclusion. And as far as issues of disability are concerned, of course, that implies that there is a high likelihood that the more in-house counsel has knowledge on aspects of inclusion and diversity, then the more likely that their reasoning and their advocacy skills will be very, very supportive to the agendas of not only disability, but also even other seemingly marginalized groups. But again, number two is, of course, where in-house counsel himself or herself has ever been part of a marginalized group, or they have actually ever fallen in a marginalized sector. Now, of course, such personnel, you find that their experiences are in many, many ways more likely to make in-house counsel appreciative of the value of diversity and what we call inclusionary recruitment models when designing what we call employment contracts. Now, of course, we're aware that when we talk about labor markets, it's more an issue of inclusion. Then we also have, again, in as far as inclusion, the other question is where, of course, whenever we have an ability to identify or even have an interaction with regional and international stakeholders that are willing to encourage corporate entities have inclusion on disability. Here we have examples like World Vision. We have, of course, we have advocates for international law, among other entities which are supportive of human rights causes. So the moment in-house counsel has a chance of interacting and collaborating with these entities, which are mainly civil society movements, then it makes them very supportive. But at the same time, where they can find ways of signing a company, what we call company corporate social responsibility activities, that are encompassing issues of diversity and are supportive to persons with disabilities. So this is something which can be included into what we call CSR, corporate social responsibility obligations. And then again, of course, the other aspect is where in-house counsel may be collaborative is in relation to, in as far as when is that collaboration evident. That is especially where the terms and conditions of the recruitment contracts are very supportive of what we call disability inclusiveness. And of course, this will in many respects ensure that there is, the in-house counsel tries to advise against any form of indirect or direct clauses which may be disadvantageous to inclusive recruitment, especially to East Africans with any forms of disability. So that implies in-house counsel here has a role to play in terms of ensuring that the policies are receptive as opposed to being repulsive to individuals with disability. So that could be yet another consideration. Of course, lastly, of course, there is a point of when we are looking at in-house counsel has a role in terms of participating in advising the directors, the shareholders. He may also use those opportunities to bring on board what we call the merits of inclusive employment strategies or structures. Of course, by bringing it to the attention of those corporate leadership organs, some of the advantage of actually employability of persons with disability. Now, of course, here I'm aware that different countries have different arrangements. There are countries which give tax holidays, which give maybe to those employers who have more individuals with disabilities. So in-house counsel, if it has knowledge of this, it can bring it to the attention of shareholders and other leadership entities. We can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. And then we'll have, of course, the question is how this could be effectively attained. Of course, this could involve a number of initiatives, such as ensuring that there is special value accorded to what we call the state regulatory actors. For example, of course, we look into the presence of some form of taxation regimes which can afford special considerations to persons with employers who have persons with disability. Now, at this stage, we are aware that businesses or corporate entities, they are employers in this regard, if we are looking at employee-employer relationships. So when we are looking at what could be done is to say, well, to make it very evident and very apparent that there will be certain merits which are in place, but also encouraging policymakers and to make reforms which are actually giving some sort of special incentives to these employers to make sure that corporate entities are more inclusive to those East Africans, to the different East Africans with disabilities, but also encouraging those clauses which promote what we call obligatory duties of designing work-related training manuals that are inclusive and considerate of East African employees with disability. This should become more of an institutional and a regulatory arrangement. So that implies in-house counsel could think about how maybe the manuals, training manuals, employee manuals can be designed in such a way that they are accessible, for example, to East Africans who are blind, who are deaf, but they are part of the working staffing structure. But at the same time, in-house counsel can actually sensitize the governance organs of the corporate structure. That's mainly the shareholders on one hand, but also have the stakeholders as in as far as the importance of employment contracts to be very inclusive in their nature. So of course, this can stretch beyond disability. It can stretch to women and other categories. So the role of in-house counsel is here very evident in terms of proposing and advising recruitment policies that are inclusive of what we call human resource capacities and are likely to extend to diversity. We can go to the next slide, please. Of course, that is basically what I had for this particular discussion. Thank you very much. Any comments, any remarks, any suggestions are very, very much welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivan, for that comprehensive presentation around how to ensure our business practices are actually inclusive and alive to disability rights. Our next speaker is Gloria Tengera. She's a company secretary and an in-house counsel at Development Bank of Rwanda. She'll make a presentation on best practices, stroke approaches for in-house counsel to demonstrate value addition to their boards and management on the benefits of incorporating responsible businesses and sustainable development goals as part of their operations. Gloria, you have the floor. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Martin. Before I jump into what I would like to discuss today, I kind of want to frame the conversation. And in so doing, I want to kind of explain that my thoughts while preparing for this were based on the challenges that I face as an in-house counsel, challenges that I know that an entrant into this position also faces or will face, and challenges that we don't often speak of as in-house counsel, especially with regard to this sort of conversations. And because the idea here is that in-house counsels are not necessarily seen as the go-to people for advocating for this type of conversation. But I'm glad that things are changing and that we're being looked at as influencers, as one of the speakers pointed it out. Today, I will focus on a few things that I think we could do as in-house counsel, but I'm glad that Nadia has sort of already shed a light on some of them and given us a more practical view. So if you could quickly jump into the presentation. I wanted to start by looking at the country perspective, that is in my case, Rwanda. And why it is important to look at the country perspective is it's because we need to be aware of what our countries are doing, especially in regards to SDGs. So in my case, SDGs have been domesticated, and this has been seen in the way they've been translated into the Vision 2050 of the country, and also the National Strategy for Transformation, NST1. This sort of gives you a guideline of where your countries or relevant jurisdictions stand with regard to SDGs. If we quickly move into the perspective of the company I work for, that is BRD, the Development Bank of Rwanda, BRD as we call it in short, we also see the trend has been trickled down. And why? This is because BRD was established by the government to address market failure through providing medium and long-term financing to key strategic sectors. So it is very important that BRD also looks at SDGs and tries to incorporate them into its strategy. Now, jumping into the discussion for today. While thinking through this topic, three major things came to mind. And the first one was, what are SDGs? And I'm not thinking of them in terms of enumerating them, all the 17 as they are, but more of in the sense of why companies should even care for them. The second thing is, how do in-house counsels prepare themselves in as far as comprehending SDGs? What is our knowledge base with regard to SDGs if we're going to influence conversations around SDGs in our companies? And then how do we now translate these SDGs into corporate culture for purposes of enforcement or achieving accountability? Jumping right into the first thought, that is advocating for SDGs. Let us try and look at SDGs in terms of how they speak to us as individuals. Because if something does not speak to you as an individual, then you probably are not going to be able to advocate for it. So if we look at very simple examples, let's say the SDG 1 that talks about no poverty, SDG 2 that talks about zero hunger. When we are ill, we hope to have access to medical care. That is SDG 3. From as young as age of 3, most of us are taken to school, and our parents are hoping that we get a good education. That is SDG 4, and so on and so forth. What is this telling us? This is telling us that as individuals, we are impacted in one way or another when it comes to these goals. And that if we don't think of ourselves as the recipients of the achievements of these goals, then we're not going to translate that to the companies that we work with or the businesses that we're in charge of. So maybe let's take this now to our companies. Which of these goals speak to us? Which ones can you identify with given on your respective businesses? Apply the same exercise. So if you did not have a recipient for that business that you're doing, would you be in business? Let me give an example of BRD. BRD looks at 5 key priority sectors, that is agriculture, energy, affordable housing and infrastructure, manufacturing and exports, and education. If you will realize, these are all catered for under the SDGs. And in one way or another, or maybe it was by pure accident, we are in one way or another, linked to these goals and doing work that is impacting these areas. So my point here is, if you are going to have a conversation around any concept, especially as an in-house counsel, who's probably not at all times seen as the one advocating for these conversations, you need to be sold on it yourself in order for you to advocate it. So that for me is the first step as an in-house counsel. The second thing that we need to think of is what kind of knowledge do you have with regard to SDGs? How have you prepared yourself to understand them in order for you to even have that conversation? So one of the few things you could start with is reading up on your country reports on how the SDGs are being implemented. Like, what does your country do? What has it not done? What challenges is it facing? What are the lessons learned? These things begin to give you insight that you probably would not have had before. And then it begins to become the basis for you to have that conversation with your companies. So for example, if I take an example of the 2019 Rwanda Voluntary National Review Report, a number of things were discussed, but I will give just a few examples. There were lessons learned that are recorded in that report that basically talked about visionary leadership and how this is important for critical achievement of the SDGs, how homegrown solutions have been rooted in the Rwandan culture, are resource efficient and play a major role in enhancing ownership and accelerating development outcomes, and a full integration of SDGs in the national planning and monitoring framework is critical for effective implementation. So if you're looking for information and you come across such an example in your country reports, the first thing you're going to look at is say, okay, my company is not far removed from the country. If homegrown solutions worked at a macro level, then maybe we could look at solutions that come from within the company, because each company relates in a different way. So look for those solutions that work for you, especially in terms of these goals, and then advocate for that. Or here, the example on visionary leadership. What that is telling us is that if your boards are not visionary boards, or management itself is not a visionary management, then probably achieving these SDGs won't be simple. So the conversation then becomes, how visionary are we? How prepared are we to take this conversation forward? So you see, you begin to get a few tips that make your conversation easier for you to have and for people to even want to listen to what you have to say. The third one, I will not go into all of them, but the third one, in the interest of time, the third one is about embedding SDGs into the company culture. What does this mean? You've now learned how to advocate. You now have more information about the SDGs, but how are you going to now make that practical? And I think it was Nadia who kind of gave us very vivid examples of what we could do. But one of the things, just to add on to what Nadia already said, you could maybe start with an independent review of the SDG compliance of your institution. What have you done so far? And where are you? Where are the gaps? And then given that analysis, then you say, okay, how do we now incorporate this into our strategy? So there are many things you could do that could ensure that you just don't talk about this on a macro level, but you actually do. Then, of course, enhancing staff capacity is very important, because at the end of the day, we are the ones who are going to make these things happen. So it is one thing to have the conversations at a management level, at a board level, but how does it trickle down to those who actually get to do the work? So these are things that you want to advocate for and to bring to the attention of management and the board. So in conclusion, In-house counsel to demonstrate value addition with regard to benefits of SDGs and responsible business, we must come from a place of awareness and knowledge. This awareness and knowledge is not restricted to just knowing the law, but should relate to information that's to businesses first before shrouding it in the law. Then compliance becomes easier for us to enforce. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you, Gloria, for that excellent presentation. I think all the presenters have been quite comprehensive. All the presentations have been quite comprehensive, rich in knowledge, and we've all greatly benefited from the wealth of knowledge that has been shared by the different speakers. So we now want to go to Q&A. Those online, you're free to just send your any questions that you may have, that you may want to be directed to any of the panelists. As we wait on questions from our online viewers, I'll just pose one or two questions to one of the panelists. The first question is, how can FOID's SDG legal initiative best reach out to in-house counsel in Africa? The other question is, what would be the usefulness of companies, businesses in East Africa to be involved in an initiative such as SDG legal initiative? I think I could pose this question to Nadia and also to Gloria, because they're in-house counsels. And then the first question can go to Jessica or even Claire.
Martin, sorry, are you able to please repeat the question you want me to address?
Okay, no worries, Nadia. So the question is, what would be the usefulness of companies, businesses in East Africa to be involved in an initiative such as SDG legal initiative? You've given us Safaricom's story, and I just thought I would pose this question to you to tell our audience here why it would be useful.
The most important part of working with like-minded companies like A4ID is the fact that we're able to exchange ideas. We can't all make mistakes and learn from them. So if we can learn from each other's mistakes, then that will mean we'll go further even faster. And I've worked with A4ID for the last four or so years. And it's been quite interesting because then we're able to learn from each other, exchange ideas, and do better for our organizations in terms of the SDG integration. You're also able to meet other companies, not necessarily only within Kenya or East Africa, but globally, and learn from their best practices. So events like the one that we've had today are beneficial not only to us, but also to the audience. And the more people that we can get onto this bandwagon, the better for all of us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nadia. I want to pose the same question to Gloria.
I think for me, it's the structure that it will bring in. So as I kind of alluded to my earlier presentation, we're kind of all left to our own little worlds, and sometimes you don't know what is happening out there. But when a certain organization comes into place, what it does is that it exposes you to so many things that you could only imagine. And then in so exposing, it also then gives you that structure that you need to take this conversation further and to have it more solidified within your companies. So for me, that would be the major takeaway from this. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Gloria. If I could pose the same question to Ivan.
In as far as the way most of these ideas can be efficiently extended to reach in-house counsel, I think the element of training is very key. Of course, because if there is awareness, that really impacts not only practice in terms of how corporate entities undertake their activities, but also in terms of how corporate entities make decisions. So I think training will be very key as a starting point, and but also ensuring that indeed the policy documents, like maybe the manual, the human resource manual, talk about the corporate strategy, talk about the corporate sustainable development strategy or corporate social responsibility structures. By all means, they should incorporate in them SDGs, so that there is more of a practical and less of a theoretical based framework for the corporate entities. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivan. So I'll go back to the first question. How can A4ID's SDG Legal Initiative best reach out to in-house counsel in East Africa? And I will pose that question to the other panelists. I will start with Claire.
Hi.
Claire, I think you're muted. Oh, that's okay. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, I haven't been so involved in this initiative yet, but I think lawyers have a really important role to play. We're asked to advise businesses on public and commercial and financial and legal implications, and there are huge benefits in sharing that know-how in an appropriate way that respects anti-competitive laws as well. But the more that we pull in the same direction and that we can leverage relationships, the greater benefit there can be. And I think it's also important that the law isn't static. It's dynamic, it's evolving, and what's considered unethical or reputational risks today may well be unlawful tomorrow. We see legislative change developing fast. So sharing experiences
Thank you, Claire.
is really important.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Claire. So I want to pose the same question to John, to Jessica, sorry, Jessica Lobo.
Thanks, Martin. Could you just repeat the question, please? I think I'm having some internet problems.
Jessica, can you hear us?
Yes, sorry, I think I may be having some internet problems. Could you repeat the question for me, Martin?
Sure, will do, Jessica. So the question was, how can A4ID's SDG Legal Initiative best reach out to in-house counsel in East Africa?
Well, I guess probably to echo Claire's remarks, I'm not as familiar with the initiative as I am with some of the other ones around the SDGs, but I think that opportunity really to be part of something external, something legitimate that's actually encouraging people to be involved with the agenda and to get kind of updates and as Claire was talking about, being able to be involved in a network where you can then share best practices and challenges and also share updates on what the legal environment is. I think that's really invaluable, and I think just being able to join forums, join events like this where you can share with other people but also encourage your networks to get involved is going to be, I think, one of the most important ways forward for initiatives like this.
Thanks, Jessica. So I'd want to invite Yasmin Patliwala to answer the same question. Yasmin.
Thank you very much indeed, Martin. So from the perspective of A4ID, what we would like to do, we are going to be writing and talking to bar councils and also organizations like the law societies across the world. And particularly for us, because of our good relationship with the East Africa Law Society, we hope to be able to use that relationship and partnership working with them on helping to perhaps use it as a model par excellence. In respect to practical work, A4ID has a lot of projects that are available, that we can make available to individual organizations, corporates that might be interested to do that. We're developing a website so that we will be putting an interactive website. So we will be putting the types of projects that people are doing so that people can get good ideas from each other and share good practice across the globe. And also what we have done is we have put together a comprehensive legal guide to the Sustainable Development Goals that helps the legal community understand exactly what each and every goal needs to cover within the legal context. And so that in itself will be, I think, an invaluable tool for in-house counsels to properly understand exactly how the law applies in this context. We have launched, and you've received on the chat function, our first one, which is SDG 16, which I call the lawyer's agenda. So that's now available to you, but over the course of the next 6 months, we'll be launching each individual goal so that it is available to all of you to be able to start off with. The last thing I'll say is please get in touch with us. As I said, join us, get in touch with A4ID, get in touch with me directly or my colleagues in the organization, and we can together work and make all of this happen. Thank you.
Thanks, Yasmin. So I have a question for Claire. Claire, you spoke in your presentation, you highlighted that Kenya and Uganda have national action plans on business and human rights. And you also spoke about some of the international principles, OECD guidelines and the Equator Principles. Based on the fact that most multinationals, have subsidiaries or actually have branches within some of our East African countries, that's actually in almost all the East African countries or some. My question to you would be, how can the other countries, that is, other than Kenya, learn from Kenya and Uganda, or how can they be able to come up with national action plans on business and human rights? What do what the lawyers, what do litigators, lawyers, or even practitioners out there do in order to embrace a national action plan on business and human rights? That is for Tanzania, Burundi, and Sudan and South Sudan. What can they learn from us? And then the other question is on how can these guidelines that you mentioned be implemented in our jurisdiction here?
So it's on the first of all, on the national action plans, there's a very good site, I think it's run by the Danish Institute for Human Rights, called Global NAPs, and so Global National Action Plans, which sets out all of the different national action plans. And the Danish Institute also has some guidance for groups that want to progress national action plans. There is an initiative in Tanzania as well, I think. I'll circulate the link in a moment. But I think it is a non-state initiative in Tanzania. So there are many ways of doing that. the other initiative that I've seen growing, and in fact we did a pro bono project recently to review this, is for law societies to endorse or issue guidance in relation to the UNGPs. So the International Bar Association, the American Bar Association, the English Law Society, the Australian Law Council, the European Federation, like many bar associations have now endorsed the UNGPs and issued guidance for their members. And I think that will continue to grow. I know there are a number of projects in different countries where law societies are considering how to support their own members and their own lawyers in how to practically implement UNGPs. So both of those are very useful resources to think about.
Thank you, Claire. I have a question for Jessica Lobo. So Jessica, you gave us a very comprehensive presentation around SDGs and highlights and top trends. So how can we accelerate the realization of these SDGs in light of the fact that when you look at different jurisdictions around the world, we are not at some level of development, but well, we want to realize this by 2030. So how could what are some of the practices that either corporates can or practitioners can embrace to actually fast track the realization of SDGs? Over to you, Jessica.
Thank you. Yeah, I think one of the things that we always tell businesses is to actually undertake a bit of an exercise to look at where your biggest impacts are, whether those are negative impacts or positive impacts, and actually map that to the SDGs. Will help you to understand where it is that you can then drive those changes and the biggest impacts that you can have on the SDG agenda. And I think that's something really important, because obviously all businesses are different and operating in, as you said, different jurisdictions, operating in different sectors. They're of different natures, different sizes. So I couldn't really recommend that kind of one size fits all to a business when they've got such different impacts. So I think taking that exercise and doing that kind of piece of mapping is really crucial for a business to then understand what impact they're having on the Sustainable Development Goals. For smaller businesses and well, actually, I suppose any business of any size who don't have that kind of capacity to undertake that really detailed mapping exercise, that's where those benchmarks come in that I was speaking about right at the beginning of the event. They are applicable to all businesses. They might not be the biggest impacts, but they are impacts that businesses are driving. So things around having gender balance at all levels of management, or implementing 100% living wage across the organization, or looking at kind of supply chain, setting science-based targets. Those are things that I think all businesses will be impacting in some way or another. And that, I think, is quite a, I don't want to say straightforward, because sometimes actually doing some of those actions is quite complicated, but and quite complex. But I think that is one path that a business could take to then really be driving changes for the Sustainable Development Goals.
Okay, thanks, Jessica, for that. Thanks for that response. My next question is to Ivan Mugabe, who made a presentation on the role of in-house counsel in advocating for non-discrimination and inclusion. So, Ivan, what can corporates? What are some of the best practices that corporates can embrace in terms of realizing non-discrimination and inclusion within, specifically around disability rights?
All right, thank you very much, Martin. The best practices in as far as inclusion and realization of disability rights, I think this range there is a range of policies which can be adopted. And one of them could be accessibility policies. I think corporate entities or corporate structures should have policies which are aiming at enhancing accessibility. And I mean, broadly speaking, accessibility should be construed in a wider context that ranges from making sure that buildings, workplaces, offices of these corporate entities are actually accessible to whether, this particular employee with disabilities using wheelchair must be able to access the office. Then, of course, communication mechanism, if they are communicating using maybe certain formats which must be communicated in ways, for example, Braille formats. Now, of course, I'm aware that some of these may have some sort of expenses to the corporate entity, but they may in the long run reflect an inclusive recruitment strategy. So accessibility will be very, very key, but at the same time, there should be other supportive mechanisms other than accessibility. For instance, if it comes maybe to working from home, where we are looking at issues of maybe COVID, there must be some form of facilitation to allow that to have software and technologies which can enhance these employees with disability to be in position to deliver their services from home as well. But again, the other one will be in terms of income, what we call salary scales and income payment rates. I think the payment strategies must also be structured or designed in such a way that they address what we call income inequalities. It's very evident and apparent that when we are looking at employees, you may find that it's more likely that employees with disabilities are more likely to have to be earning relatively lower. So the corporate entity could address the issues of salary scales and income rates so that income inequalities are overcome amongst employees with disabilities. So if you overcome income inequalities, indirectly you are overcoming health inequalities, and in the long run you are overcoming what we probably could also call economic inequalities in terms of education. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivan. So I'd want to take this opportunity to thank all our presenters for today, Jessica Lobo, Claire Cornell, Nadia Aziz, Ivan Mugabe, and Gloria Tengera for the excellent and rich presentations that I believe we have all benefited from. I would also want to take this opportunity to thank Ms. Yasmina Patliwala, the Executive Director for A4ID, for first and foremost for gracing this occasion, and also for being able to work closely with the East African Law Society to ensure that we had this important convening today. I would also want to thank the President of the East African Law Society, His Excellency Bernard Owundo, for being able to give his opening remarks and actually to attend this webinar in its entirety. So at this point in time, I would want to hand back, I would want to cede the floor to Flaviana Charles, who is the chairperson for the Business and Human Rights Committee of the East African Law Society, and Mr. David Zigano, who is the Executive Director of the East African Law Society. Thank you. Over to you, David and Flaviana.
Okay, thank you so much, Martin. Really appreciate for your good work, modulation work. You've done a very good job. So first of all, I should thank all the presenters who have taken part in presenting this a very enriching and a useful audience. This has been really helpful. And I should assure that we had more than 100 participants in the list, so that I know that I've learned a lot and I have a lot to take home. But also I think I should repeat to thank Mr. President of East African Law Society, who has graced our occasion today, and he has spoken a lot of useful words, which is we are going to take with us at home. But also I would like to thank David, Patrick, and other organizers for making sure that this event becomes a success. I would like also to pay a great thanks to the participants who have been together. We have been together from the beginning of this session. I've seen the numbers now going down. That means all the participants were listening and following up to the session, which is for staying with us and being willing to learn more. I would like also to thank the team, the BHLR team from East African Law Society, that we have discussed this for a long time now. The event has become for today, and I could see. I would like also to thank everyone who has taken part in this session to make sure that this event is becoming a successful one. Thank you so much, Martin. I've seen that you've done a great job and you're really good moderator, and I would love to give you a certificate for that. Asante Sana, you've done a great job for that. And with this, I would like also to announce that we're going to have more events, a series of webinar. This is just an opening of more webinars to come. So please make sure, and this is for the participants, make sure that you take part on it. You have a lot to learn, and you'll be able to know what it's all about when we talk about business and human rights, what it's all about. So I believe that everyone will be ambassador. We'll invite more people to attend other sessions, the other series, which is going to take place at the end of the month again. So you at the end of the next month. So we really appreciate and thank you so much. And I would like to end up with my my thankful remark by saying that Asante Sana, thank you so much. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup, Ulakozi. And let's keep on in touch. And if you get any questions, don't hesitate to make sure that you throw the question to us, and we'll be able to share with the participants so that they can be responded in the next session. Thank you so much all. I really appreciate, and God bless you all, and make sure you stay safe. Thank you. Back to David.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. To just use your words, our appreciation to all of you who have made this session possible, our appreciation to our excellent panel, our appreciation to the excellent audience that has been with us this whole session. We believe that you have learned a lot, and you are going to apply this in your institutions, in your firms, as you work towards attaining the SDGs. 2030 is not so far away. I know we have our own visions within East Africa. There's Vision 2030, there's Vision 2050. For the AU, there's Vision 2063. So all these have more or less borrowed from the SDGs. And so we have a big role to play as lawyers towards the achievement of these objectives that we've set for ourselves as humanity. Thank you to our partners who have always held our hands as we capacitate, as we reach out to East African lawyers, to East African firms in terms of their role in sustainable business and their role in the development of our communities. Thank you to FOID, thank you to White and Case, Global Compact, Safaricom, BRD, King Caesar University, and everyone else that has made this possible. We appreciate you, and we'll be looking forward to engaging you in our next sessions. Thank you, stay blessed, see you again.